In May of 1879, 74 men sat in a Paris ballroom and voted for a canal design that would kill more than 20,000 people. Only one of them had ever set foot in the jungle they were about to cut through. You have probably crossed what they were arguing about without ever knowing why it almost didn't happen. To understand why, we go back to the most celebrated engineer alive, about to build his second canal. This is the story of how France tried to build the Panama Canal first. And it went wrong in almost every way a project can. You would assume it failed because of the jungle, the disease, the bad luck. It wasn't just that. Part of what sealed its fate was a decision made in that Paris ballroom, years before a single shovel hit the dirt. Ferdinand de Lesseps was not an engineer. He had never built anything in his life. But 10 years earlier, he had done the impossible, carved a canal through Egypt's desert and joined two seas. It took him 10 years and nearly bankrupted his own backers twice before the desert finally gave way to seawater. By the time the first ship sailed through in 1869, half of Europe had doubted him and been proven wrong. The world called him a genius. Suez made him a national hero. Streets were named after him. To French investors, his name was worth more than a prospectus. Newspapers printed his face beside every advertisement for the new shares, as if buying stock in Panama was really just buying a piece of his legend. So when de Lesseps announced he would do it again in Panama, investors did not ask if he could. They only asked how much. In 1879, he gathered the world's engineers in Paris to settle one question. How do you cut a canal through a mountain and a flooding river? One engineer, Godin de Lepinay, proposed something different. Dam the rivers, raise two lakes, lift the ships up and over with locks. De Lesseps wanted none of that. He wanted the same triumph as Egypt, a canal cut straight through at sea level, no locks, no delay. A sea-level canal is just a deep ditch, a straight line for ships to sail through. A lock canal lifts ships up a hill in giant water elevators, then lowers them back down the other side. Slower to build, far easier to finish. The room voted 74-8 for de Lesseps' plan. Lepinay was one of the 8 no votes. So was a young engineer named Gustave Eiffel. Of the 74 who said yes, only 19 were engineers. Only one had ever set foot in Central America. The money did not wait for the doubts. When the company offered new shares in 1880, 100,000 people tried to buy them within 3 days, twice as many shares as were even for sale. 800,000 ordinary French citizens in total ended up in the same boat: shopkeepers, retired soldiers, small savers, none of them able to check the swamp for themselves. Thousands of workers shipped out to Panama to start cutting the canal by hand. Within months, they were dying faster than anyone could explain. Doctors did not yet know mosquitoes carried yellow fever. They blamed the swamp air itself. Malaria was killing just as many workers as the fever was, and nobody in the camp yet understood why either disease kept spreading. The fever turned skin yellow and vomit black. Workers had a name for it, and everyone in camp knew what that name meant. To keep ants off hospital beds, nurses set water dishes under every bed leg. The water bred more mosquitoes than the swamp outside ever had. The hospital, built to save the workers, was quietly killing them faster. The site's own director, Jules Dingler, lost his wife, his son, his daughter, and his daughter's fiancé to the fever within 15 months. He kept working anyway. Then he left Panama for good, and never came back. By 1884, the canal was losing more than 200 men a month. Many of the roughly 22,000 who eventually died were not French at all. The company recruited workers as far as Jamaica and Barbados, promising wages that sounded enormous back home, and their names rarely made it into any French newspaper. And the mountain itself would not cooperate. Landslides swallowed months of digging in a single night, and the deepest cut alone needed 8 times more excavation than anyone had planned for. The company was burning through money faster than it moved earth. By 1887, de Lesseps finally admitted defeat and agreed to build locks after all. the exact plan he had voted down 8 years earlier. It was too late. The company needed more money than any bank in France would lend it. So the company turned to the newspapers and the parliament and started paying both to keep the money coming in. A financier named Jacques de Reynac handed out bribes to more than 100 deputies and dozens of senators, just to keep the bonds selling while the project collapsed underneath them. In November of 1892, 2 days before he was due to testify about it, Reynac was found dead in his home. Officially, it was natural causes. Almost no one in Paris believed that. His list of bribed politicians ran in the newspaper the next morning. Then it kept running, one new name at a time, for weeks. Parisians had a nickname for the men on that list. They called them the checkards, the check-takers. The newspaper printing it, La Libre Parole, was run by a polemicist named Edouard Drumont. Each fresh name sold more copies than the last. The whole country waited to see whose name would print next. By the time any of this made the papers, the company itself was long gone. It had collapsed into liquidation back in February of 1889, 3 years before Reynac's body was ever found. 800,000 investors lost almost everything they had put in. In today's money, more than $10 billion had disappeared into a jungle, one of the largest financial scandals in French history. In 1893, de Lesseps stood trial. So did his son, Charles. So did Gustave Eiffel, the engineer who had voted against this plan from the very beginning. He was 87 years old by then and had to be helped into the courtroom. The trial ran for weeks. Newspapers printed every accusation. The public that once worshipped de Lesseps now jeered him outside the courthouse. All 3 men were convicted of fraud. All 3 were sentenced to prison. Then, months later, a higher court threw out every conviction. The statute of limitations had quietly run out first. Ferdinand de Lesseps never served a single day. Neither did Eiffel. Only one man from that trial truly paid for it. A government minister named Charles Bihout, who confessed on the stand and served 3 years in prison. Charles de Lesseps did not escape as cleanly. A second trial, this one for bribery, convicted him again. He served about a year before it was over. A second investigation in 1897 tried again to convict the politicians involved. It also ended in acquittals. The engineer who said no walked free and went back to building towers. The visionary who said yes died 2 years later, having never returned to Panama. His name buried with the project. But the canal itself did not die with him. A French engineer named Philippe Bunau-Varilla, who had worked on the original project, spent a decade trying to sell what was left of it. The company that inherited the wreckage still owned the rights, the equipment, and 11 years of work. In 1903, the United States bought all of it for $40 million. Congress had merely chosen a different route entirely, through Nicaragua, before switching to Panama at the last vote. Under a law called the Spooner Act, the United States paid off what was left of the French company and turned to the one problem no one had solved. Panama did not exist yet as a country. It was a province of Colombia, until a revolution, backed by the same interests selling the canal, made it one within days. Bunau-Varilla was so invested in the outcome that he became the brand new nation's foreign minister within days, just so he could be the one to sign the treaty with Washington himself. American doctors had learned something French doctors never had. Yellow fever did not come from bad air. It came from a single kind of mosquito. So before digging a single new mile, American engineers spent years just draining swamps, screening water tanks, and fumigating houses. The fever disappeared almost overnight. Then, American engineers looked at the same mountain and the same flooding river and made their decision. No sea-level canal. Dams. Lakes. It was almost exactly the plan Gaudin de Lepinay had proposed in that same Paris ballroom back in 1879, the plan the room had voted down 74-8. But the design was only half of it. The Americans also solved what French doctors never did, the mosquito, before they ever solved the mountain. Without both, the canal was never getting built at all. This was never really a story about a canal. It was about what happens when an entire room agrees on an answer, and the two people who disagree turn out to know something the room didn't. Turns out, The canal that finally worked was built from the plan France voted against, and the science France never had.